It's pretty wild when you think about it. How can ideas, just ideas, pass down not in books, but through memory for thousands of years, actually build an entire civilization? Well, that is the amazing story we're going to get into today. We're looking at how India's deepest philosophical and spiritual roots were formed way back in the Vedic age and what came after. All right, let's jump right in.
So, this ancient saying really hits the nail on the head for what we're talking about. I mean, think about it. In a world where things come and go, what really sticks around? Well, for the thinkers of ancient India, the answer was crystal clear. The only real wealth, the greatest wealth of all, is knowledge. And believe me, that one powerful idea, it was the spark for a huge intellectual revolution. Okay, so here are the key figures in our story. First, you've got a Vedic rishi, a wise sage who helped create the sacred hymns that were really the foundation of everything. But then you get these two revolutionaries, the Buddha and Mahavira. These guys came along and really challenged the old ways of thinking. They offered people totally new paths to find answers, not just by doing rituals, but by looking inside themselves. And wow, their ideas would change India forever. All right, so where does this whole story kick off? Well, it all starts with what you could call India's oldest library. But get this, it was a library with 0 books. I'm not kidding. It was this huge collection of knowledge that was stored completely in people's minds. This amazing mental library was known as the Vedas. And the name itself tells you pretty much everything. The word Veda comes from this Sanskrit root, vid, which just means to know. Simple, right? So these texts were seen as the ultimate source of knowledge, the real deal. And they were put together thousands and thousands of years ago in a region called Sapta Sindhu. Now, it wasn't just one book or one Veda. There were actually 4 main collections, and each one kind of had its own special focus. And we're not talking about history books or instruction manuals here. Nope. These were massive collections of hymns, prayers, and deep philosophical poems. But here's the part that just blows my mind. For more than 1,000 years, all of this was passed down just by word of mouth. From teacher to student, generation after generation, no writing involved. I mean, the level of precision this took was so incredible that today, UNESCO actually calls it a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Just try to wrap your head around that. Thousands and thousands of verses memorized so perfectly that not one single syllable was changed for centuries. That's an absolutely stunning testament to the power of human memory and pure dedication. This timeline really helps put things in perspective, because we're talking about a huge amount of time. So around 1500 BCE, we see the start of the first Veda, the Rig Veda. Then, fast forward a few hundred years, and new ideas start popping up in these texts called the Upanishads. And then, bam! Around 500 BCE, our 2 big thinkers, the Buddha and Mahavira, arrive on the scene. We're looking at 1,000 years of really profound change here. Okay, so all of this history was leading up to a really big turning point. Society was changing, right? People were settling down, towns and kingdoms were starting to form, and with that came a new kind of curiosity. People started to shift from just, doing the rituals to actually thinking about what they really meant. Don't get me wrong, the Vedic culture had all these important rituals and ceremonies, and they were a big part of life. But a new generation of thinkers started to ask, is this it? Is this all there is? They were asking the big questions. What is reality, really? What happens to us after we die? Suddenly, the old answers just didn't seem to cut it anymore. And you can totally feel this new spirit of questioning in the texts called the Upanishads. They're basically these deep philosophical conversations filled with stories about the search for knowledge. One of the most famous tales is about this kid, a young boy named Nachiketa. He was so bold and so curious that he marched right up to Yama, the god of death himself, and started demanding answers. And what was the question he wanted answered? Oh, just the biggest question of all. What happens when we die? This wasn't about how to do a ceremony the right way. No, this was a deep dive, a search for the truth about what it even means to exist. So the Upanishads offered a pretty game-changing answer to questions like the one Nachiketa was asking. They basically said, hey, stop looking out there for answers. They turned the whole search for truth inward, focusing not on gods or rituals outside of us, but on the secret hidden within our own self. To really get their answer, you need to know about 2 massive ideas. First, there's Brahman. Think of it as the universal spirit, the cosmic energy that makes up, everything. It's like a giant, endless ocean. Then, on the other hand, you have Atman. That's the individual self, the little piece of soul inside every single living thing. So, if Brahman is the ocean, your Atman is like one single drop of water from that ocean.
And this all comes down to one super famous phrase, Tat Vam Asi. It means you are that. What the Upanishads were saying is that your individual self, your Atman, isn't actually separate from that universal spirit, Brahman. The drop is the ocean. And figuring out, truly realizing that deep connection, well, that was seen as the whole point of life.
Okay, so from this one core idea, two main paths sort of branched out. First, you have Vedanta. That was the path of the mind. It was all about using study and deep thought to intellectually understand that Atman-Brahman connection. And then you have yoga. That was the path of the body, using real, practical things like meditation and physical postures to actually feel and experience that connection for yourself.
But wait, the Upanishads weren't the only new game in town. Right around the same time, a couple of other totally radical thinkers showed up on the scene, and they offered completely different ways to think about life's biggest questions. I'm talking about the Buddha and Mahavira.
So these two new paths were led by these two incredible guys. And what's wild is that they were living at the same time in pretty much the same part of India. What they both offered was a way to deal with life suffering that put you, the individual, in the driver's seat. No more needing priests or complicated rituals to find your answers. The power was in your hands.
The Buddha's story, it's just such a powerful human story. He started out as a prince named Siddhartha Gautama, totally sheltered from anything bad. But then, one day, he sees real life, old age, sickness, death, and it just rocks his world. He couldn't unsee it, so he gives up his palace, his whole royal life, to find a way to end suffering for good. After searching for years, he finally just sits down under a tree, meditates, and has this massive breakthrough about how reality works. That's when he becomes the Buddha, which means the awakened one.
Then there's Mahavira, the great teacher of Jainism. His path was all about intense self-discipline, and its core ideas are really something else. First, you have ahimsa, which is total, absolute nonviolence. He taught that every single living being, from a human to a tiny ant, has a soul and should be respected. Then there's aparigraha, or non-possession. The idea here is that having a ton of stuff just weighs you down and keeps you from being truly free. And finally, there's anekantavada, this amazing concept that truth is complex and no one person has the complete picture, so we have to be open to different points of view. Now, it would be really easy to imagine these big new philosophies just popping up in a vacuum, completely separate from each other. But the reality was way more interesting and, frankly, a lot messier than that. You see, all these new ideas were bubbling up in a place that was already overflowing with ancient folk and tribal traditions. So here's the key takeaway. This was not a one-way street. The Vedic tradition, Buddhism, Jainism, they didn't just appear and take over. They were in constant conversation with all the local beliefs and practices that had been around for ages. They influenced those traditions for sure, but they were also influenced by them. It was like one big ongoing cultural conversation. And here is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The deity Jagannath, now a hugely important figure in Hinduism, worshipped by millions, actually started out as a deity worshipped by a tribal community in the area of Odisha. Over a long time, these local traditions got woven into the bigger cultural fabric, which made the whole thing richer and created something totally new and alive. You know, this quote from the sociologist André Bataille just nails it. It wasn't about one culture wiping out another one, not at all. It was a long, slow process of mutual enrichment. All these different threads, the Vedic ideas, Buddhism, Jainism, and all the local tribal traditions, they all got woven together to create this incredibly complex and beautiful tapestry that is Indian civilization. And that brings us to one final thought to leave you with. This amazing process of ideas bumping into each other, mixing together, and creating something new, well, it didn't just stop 2,500 years ago. It's still happening, right now, all around us. So here's a question for you to think about. Where do you see different ideas and traditions mixing it up today, creating brand new ways of thinking about our world?